everybody, and welcome to episode number 165 of Chamber TV. I'm Laurie White from the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce, and today we're continuing our series of conversations with candidates seeking public office in Rhode Island. And today we are talking to David Segal, who is running for the 2nd Congressional District seat here in the state. So how are you, David?
I'm doing well. This is an interesting thing to do and very, very busy, but glad I'm doing it.
Fantastic. So you have a distinguished career in public service. You have served as a member of the Providence City Council. You have also served as a state representative for a number of years, and you've been actively involved in public policy since your days of leaving the State House. So I'm wondering, David, first of all, it's great to have this opportunity to be able to get to know you a little better and to get some insights as to your perspective. But give us your backstory, if you will, and tell us what's motivating you to step out into this area, into this platform right now.
Sure thing. Thank you for the opportunity. So it's essentially, as you said, I first ran for city council in Providence, I guess exactly 20 years ago, as part of an effort to try to institute a living wage ordinance at the city level, and went on to work on a variety of issues at the city council level and then at the State House for 4 years, for 2 terms, where I, among other things, helped organize our Progressive Caucus. And then I left office and co-founded a national advocacy organization that works on a variety of different issues that are relevant to folks here and across the country. And all the while, I've been continuing to build democratic infrastructure here and help candidates run issue campaigns and so on. So at this point, I've gotten to work on, and I'm very privileged to be able to say this, on essentially, on more or less every issue that might be salient to folks these days, and have a fair amount of experience moving the ball forward. And running for Congress because Rhode Islanders understand that government should be able to do more. And I think people are rightly frustrated that we're dealing with so many issues that have gone unaddressed for decades, whether we're talking about building an economy that genuinely works for everybody, or securing genuinely universal access to high quality healthcare, or accelerating the transition to a renewable energy economy in a way that helps save the environment and creates high road union jobs in the process. And I think voters need to trust that when we say we care about these issues and other issues, that we're actually going to try to deliver on them. And I have now, over the course of those 20 years, a long record of building the broad coalitions that I think are necessary in order to make government do more for people. And I'm hoping that that experience will earn me the support of the voters in District 2 during this run for Congress.
Yeah, interesting look back, David, on some of the issues that have been very important to you over the years. Curious to know, what your thoughts are as to how today's electorate might be different than the electorate you confronted back when you were in public office, a few years ago. Do you see any seismic shift, if you will?
I think things have, and thank you for the question. I mean, my broad take would be that I think that folks, and even policymakers who I haven't disagreed with, recognizing increasingly that the structures that we were operating under for decades, deregulation across a variety of different sectors and so on. I think most, prominently the financial sector and the ways in which that led to the housing crash and the financial crisis that happened while I was in the assembly, were not working for people. And we have seen a shift, I think, in the electorate so that folks increasingly recognize that government can do more for people and that we should demand that it do so. And I think we've also begun to see this manifest at all levels of governance, city, state, and federal, where I've been able to work over the years. By no means have we successfully addressed every problem that's before us, but I think we are making progress on some fronts in a way that makes me quite hopeful, and in some ways it's been surprising to me.
Yeah. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the tenor of the discussion the dialogue, the atmosphere, the level of respect, if you will, in Congress, among the electeds in Congress towards other perspectives. You know, you mentioned just a few moments ago, you know, elected officials who, you know, perhaps have a point of view that you may or may not agree with. But what do you see this overall deterioration of some of the more iconic institutions in our world being a bit more intolerant, and how do you slice that, if you will?
I think that things are increasingly factional. I think there are a variety of different factors in play. Some of these, you know, some of it relates to trends that I think were with us for a while, where there's more, you know, ideological sorting based on geography. People are able to move around more and more, which is great in many ways, but means that you tend to have, you know, progressives and liberals end up in certain places and more conservative people in other places. A lot of people operate within what, you know, the online terminology for this is the filter bubble. Like, they hear from people whom they tend to agree with and are less exposed to ideas that they might not have thought of before, or that they might disagree with. And I'm worried about that polarization. I think there's still a lot of opportunities to work with people across ideological notions, and even across, you know, party lines sometimes. And, you know, I'm very proud of my record of, while being decidedly progressive in my ideals, looking for opportunities to work with not just only other progressives, but also traditional Democrats and independents, and sometimes, you know, even Republicans, when we have a common interest. And, you know, when there's legislation before us that we agree on, maybe because of different perspectives, or maybe because we more or less do see it from the same vantage point. And I've been able to do that at all levels of governance. A lot of that work is manifesting at the federal level in recent months and years around anti-monopoly policy in particular, which we can hopefully talk about a bit more, because I think it does affect the business community here, in addition to affecting rank and file consumers.
Okay, go right ahead. Let's get right into it. So you're talking about, are you talking about Facebook and the world of social media and large technology companies that, in essence, have a monopoly on the ways in which we communicate, and the way applications and other units are shared and developed and populated and sold? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I think that was very well put. And there's been tremendous consolidation in the tech sector. And I've worked on communications policy for a decade or so now. But we've also seen consolidation across a variety of other sectors over recent years. And I think people see it showing in a variety of different ways right now. It's contributing to the supply chain crisis and inflation that follows from it. I think that what we're seeing with baby formula right now is a horrible circumstance, literally putting lives of, you know, our very most vulnerable community members in jeopardy. And that market's been incredibly consolidated. I think there are 3 firms that account for 90% plus of the baby formula supply. And so when one factory was taken out because of potential contamination, led to these ripple effects across the market, and have, you know, made, you know, all sorts of people face these desperate situations where they need to worry about their, you know, the very ability of them to sustain their children. It's horrifying, and it's a function of market structures in large part. But to the tech sector in particular, that's one space where I've worked at great length alongside members of Congress, and trying to get the administrative state, like the FTC and the Department of Justice and others, to begin to enforce anti-monopoly laws that have been on the books for decades, you know, for a century, but have largely gone unused. And so we've allowed Facebook to buy up its competitors. We allow companies like Google to preference their own products, their own services, over services of potential competitors. We allow Amazon to engage in a whole host of anti-competitive practices that impact small businesses, sometimes put them out of business, sometimes extract from them in ways that make it harder for them to stay in business and keep them, you know, just operating at subsistence. And I was thinking, as I was preparing for this conversation, one place where, you know, we were probably working in alignment, not really directly with one another, but in parallel in various ways, going back a decade, was to try to incubate a robust tech sector here in Rhode Island. We had incubators operating in Providence. And There are some successes, but we saw the extraordinary pressures that those firms faced, many of which saw state investment, to leave the state if they became successful in order to achieve a second round of funding, or in order to potentially become acquired by a larger company, by a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon or somebody else, so that the initial investors could see an exit. And so long as we continue to have these incredibly concentrated markets in the tech space, it's going to be even more arduous for us to achieve even a baseline center of gravity in the tech space in Rhode Island. I've had some friends who've had to leave because of this. I've had one or two friends who've been lucky enough that they've been so integral to their companies, they've been able to fight it out and force firms that didn't want to allow for them to have a 1 or 2 person Providence office. But we need to address the structures of these markets so that we can have robust economies and give smaller businesses and startups a chance of surviving across a whole slew of different sectors.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. I do recall that whole scenario very vividly. And I think what you're outlining here, David, is a couple of strands of thought. One is the difficulty for tech-based businesses to access sources of capital for exit, as you mentioned, given the fact that Rhode Island is a small state and a lot of the action is happening, 50 miles away, that it hasn't really spilled over into Rhode Island, into Providence, as we had all hoped for and wanted, despite the fact that there were so many institutional partners and academic partners and business leaders that were, hoping to spur, funding sources from private sector entities. So I think, you're absolutely right. That was one piece. And then the second piece that you're describing, again, is the concentration of markets and specifically for companies that were trying to get an exit in the tech space, having to, bump up against, that solid wall of resistance, if you will. So what, I'm curious to know what you're thinking today relative to the local startup environment in Providence. You're very familiar with that. How would your candidacy in the 2nd Congressional District really encapsulize or shine a spotlight on what's happening here in the city relative to new and exciting business development in the innovation space?
Well, I think we need to deal with these national dynamics in order to give ourselves an optimal chance of succeeding in the startup realm. And again, we see this across a variety of different industries. I think it's most apparent in the tech industry, but of course, there's been consolidation in banking and in pharma, internet service provision is generally by a monopoly, and energy provision is generally by like local monopoly, and so on. And across all of these different sectors, the small businesses are being forced out, we're being extracted from. And when you don't have small businesses that are able to survive and to thrive, you end up harming the community more broadly. You reduce the small d democratic aspects of our economy. You make it harder for people to find fulfilling work and make a living and secure broader benefits for their community that fall from employment and just stability of main streets and so on. But I think in the tech sector in particular, but to a degree across all these sectors, we need to be looking at consolidation and anti-competitive practices. There's a whole package of bills that I'm sure you're familiar with that David Segal has helped steward through the House Judiciary Committee and the antitrust subcommittee that he runs. And I'm very supportive of that whole package. There are some other bills. There's a Warren, Mondale, Jones bill that would push back against consolidation in other sectors more broadly. And we also need to be ensuring that the agencies that have enforcement power, like the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice, and to some degree antitrust enforcement, is spread out across a variety of different agencies, some agencies that have specific jurisdiction over their sectors, but DOJ and FTC have sort of the broadest jurisdiction over antitrust. We need to make sure that they're empowered to enforce the law and that we give them new tools with which to do so when necessary. But I think to see a robust tech sector here, we're going to need to change things so that these centers of gravity. Yes, in Boston, and we, like you said, we haven't even seen that much spillover from Boston, and in San Francisco, and increasingly, in Austin and a couple of other jurisdictions. We need to work to distribute that energy and that capital more broadly across the whole country, so that communities like Providence are in a position to reap the rewards of an increasingly robust tech sector.
To build on that a little bit, the Great Resignation, if you will, what it's being called, where individuals are really like rethinking what they want to do with the rest of their lives, and it cuts across all sectors, all dimensions, all income levels. What are you seeing on the campaign trail? What are people telling you about, where they are in terms of careers and what they're looking for, and how Rhode Island leaders, Rhode Island business leaders, Rhode Island public policy leaders can better understand what's happening in this market that is just vacillating, wildly?
I think that the people being able to switch from one job to another, or being able to take some time off, I think is in general a good thing, and demonstrates that there is market power for workers right now. And that's in meaningful part a function of the recovery here in the US, broadly speaking, having been relatively robust, especially when we look back at what happened in 08-09, when the federal government kind of just left us hanging. I remember being in the assembly back then and fighting against budget cuts to cities and towns, and we were praying for and kind of expecting, because there was Democratic control over the Congress and over the presidency, that there would be a quote unquote second stimulus that would come through to buttress infrastructure and state and municipal spending. And it just never showed up. And that led to cuts and a cycle of disinvestment that made it harder for cities and towns to serve and provide basic services, and increased pressure on regressive property taxes and so on and so forth. And so back then I did what I could to stand against it. I think in contrast, we've actually, while the recovery has been imperfect and inflation is of course a problem we absolutely need to tackle, we have an economy that is back to its pre-pandemic GDP, and even a little bit ahead of it. I think we're back on the pre-pandemic GDP trend line, which is really extraordinary. And I think that goes to some of what I was saying earlier on about how the ideological climate has shifted, and people now expect government to do more for them, which is, as I said, a proposition I stand for. I think that I think we see people moving around in part because the recovery has been more robust. I think that people who are shifting between jobs are, of course, concerned about healthcare access. And, I support a Medicare for All plan that would provide people healthcare access, regardless of their employment, and would also alleviate a lot of the healthcare burden that we as a society foist upon small business owners right now. It doesn't make any sense. And I think we also need to accommodate to the Great Resignation by recognizing that we are seeing, finally, I think this is the thing we anticipated for a while. At some points we wanted it, at other points we've been more wary of it, but I think we see a lot of people moving to Rhode Island from Boston and from other higher cost regions because we're still relatively lower cost and obviously have an extraordinary standard of living and really dynamic culture. But it's going to put increased pressure on housing costs here. And so we need at the city and state and of course federal levels housing policies that accommodate to the fact that we have a housing shortage generally speaking, but we also see particular markets where that's where costs are spiking more than others by virtue of people wanting to move there.
You mentioned government, voters, citizens asking for government really to solve a lot of these problems and to take responsibility for them, and really stepping up. And what I also would add is you're seeing a similar notion where the public is really relying on business to fill a very specific void, if you will, and solve a lot of the problems and contribute and be sensitive to a lot of the problems that are facing this planet. So, kind of a philosophical question, if you will, where do you come down in terms of supporting businesses, helping businesses be able to do what's its best interest for their own stakeholders, whether it be the communities they serve, whether it be their own employees, whether it be their investors, whether it be other partnerships in the community. How do you ensure? How do you build up to have a strong business base and at the same time be able to use the power of business in a way that keeps them competitive, if you will, which is, their first task in life is to be in business and to sustain themselves and sustain their employees and sustain their enterprises. So a little bit of a philosophical question about how do we do both, recognizing that people, in fact, want businesses to lead and to be healthy at the same time.
I think that ideally we end up in a dynamic where we've aligned the incentives, where we have businesses operating in ways where what is in the interest of their bottom line lines up with what's best for our communities more broadly. I mean, my broad vision is a society in which we have a lot of smaller and mid-sized firms, ideally like locally owned, so people are able to contribute to their communities, create stability and employment in their communities, with a robust social safety net, inclusive of programs like Medicare for All. So we remove the burden of paying for healthcare from smaller businesses, and also so that people don't need to fear literally for their lives sometimes if they find themselves out of work. And where we have a government that is providing jobs where we need to fill gaps. There's a lot of talk right now, I think rightly, about doing more to support care work, for instance, an incredibly important endeavor that people are not paid what they should be for it, and sometimes paid not at all for it, of course, in many home care circumstances. And where we have active government enforcement of rules to make it hard for the biggest players to monopolize industries and put others out of business, and in so doing, put people out of work and gut the communities that such businesses were a part of.
Moving into how your message is resonating on the campaign trail and building on some of those themes that you just outlined around concentration of markets and around healthcare and around survivability. Give us a snapshot, if you will, of a day in life of David Segal on the campaign trail. Are you using in-person tactics? Are you deploying more sophisticated algorithms to get to your target audiences? How is your campaign unfolding in new and unexpected ways?
Without asking for any proprietary secrets, as though there are any, we're using all the tools available to us. So a lot of it's going to be knocking on doors and trying to talk to every single voter in the district. And we're starting our field program this week, and we expect that to become much more robust over time. We have a great base of 200 or 300 people who've signed up to be volunteers so far, and we're going to try to get them out, and many, many others as the campaign gets more robust. It seems as though just today a letter landed. We sent that out to around 50,000 voters. That is a 4-page personal letter by me that explains my background and talks about why I'm running for Congress and why I'm hoping to see support from the voters in this district. We are using online tactics, and we'll be just out and about, going to events, debates, conversations like this one, various public forums, all of the usual things. Like there's no one weird trick that you win a campaign by. You need to work across all of these different fronts in order to make sure that every voter hears your message. And I think that ours is resonant. I think people do think the government should be able to do more. And I think that they get that the best way of making that happen is to build these broad coalitions. I'll say that some of my most rewarding conversations on the campaign trail so far have been with former colleagues of mine, or sometimes other people who I used to get to work with in my capacity as a lawmaker. Many of them are people who themselves are out of office and probably don't intend to run for office again. And it's nice to hear people say things like, look, David, I know you've been a progressive for a very long time. You were maybe a progressive before I even knew what that was, but we found ways to work together, even though I consider myself to be a more traditional Democrat, or even a conservative Democrat in some cases. And that, I think, goes to what this campaign is about. I bring these deep progressive values to this campaign, but I'm looking for opportunities to work with people, not to dismiss them. And this anti-monopoly issue, the extraordinary force of corporate power and the outsized control that it has over our lives, over our economy, over our democracy, is one of those issues where people across the political spectrum understand what's going on.
Do you think that sentiment is reciprocal, if you will? And you think about some of our elected leaders in Congress that really have been super strong, moderate Democrats, even moderate Republicans, and being able to, yes, as you point out, reach across the aisle and to debate honestly, debate, in ways that's very transparent. But it seems to some that middle, that moderate middle is starting to atrophy just a little bit. And you are potentially left with more extreme points of view on both sides, frankly. So where do you come down relative to, that moderate middle? And do you agree that the types of the tone and the types of conversations that we're hearing in Washington are just, going in a place that we haven't seen before?
I think the tone of the conversations is pretty abysmal. I think that this is exacerbated by social media, taking everything back to tech, exacerbated by social media, the incentives that it creates, the incentives under which the social media firms operate, and then the incentives they then create for our own behavior. And so they do best when they keep us addicted and clicking on content, clicking on ads. And the things that addict us most are when they serve polarizing content, hateful content to us. And so they have all of the incentives in the world to zip the worst, most vile, or just angriest, meanest stuff across the internet. And then it means that if you want a big social media following, there are incentives for you to be somebody who then participates in that kind of rhetoric, because then your content will be the content that flies furthest and fastest and accumulates the most engagement and helps you build followers. And I think we are seeing that take over discussion in DC, and you can tell that people are operating within that incentive model, and it has impacts in our local communities too. And it is very concerning to me. And again, goes to why I think we need to do something to regulate these business models better. And for instance, take a look at the surveillance advertising model under which these companies operate, so they can target ads as granularly as possible in order to extract as much from advertisers. And that's one big facet of why they have these incentives to push the worst content out as far as possible.
Can you imagine a society without social media? Do you think it'll ever fall by the wayside?
I still maybe naively believe in the promise of the internet. I got involved in this work not back in the 80s or 90s when the real utopians were developing the internet to begin with. But I have gotten to know a few of those folks over the years. But I got involved in the late aughts, or circa 2010, before Google and Facebook and Amazon were nearly as dominant as they are now. I mean, Facebook went on to buy WhatsApp, went on to buy Instagram after that. Both of those deals should have been blocked. So I want a world with social media, but with more humane social media, where we aren't serving the most vile content and the most polarizing content to as many people as possible. I think there's still potentially something transcendent in the idea of all of humanity being able to connect in this online forum and engage with each other. And obviously it's made, it's created all kinds of efficiencies. I mean, we're having this conversation, and so many of us were able to work from home during the pandemic and do something bit to dampen the disruption to society that followed from the pandemic by virtue of being hooked together online. But I want to return it to something that more approximates that idealized vision that led to its creation to begin with.
So your point of view is that the advertising-driven model and being hell-bent to get those eyeballs is
Yes.
at the root of how we're seeing things go off the rails.
The advertising model and consolidation and other incentives that the companies have, but I think the advertising model is a really big part of it.
What do you think is going to happen with Twitter and potentially under Elon Musk?
I can't tell what's happening exactly. I feel like I see something new in the news every day about the likelihood that it's going to happen. And then I think I saw something probably on Twitter about the likelihood that it might not happen now. I can't remember exactly what I saw. I think the FTC and SEC are both looking at elements of it now, as a couple of days ago. My take on it is that it's concerning that we have billionaires and corporations with so much control over how we talk and who's allowed to talk and the forums in which we do so. It's not new that the relatively wealthy own these means of communication. Of course, we used to have individually owned newspapers in different communities across the country, but it was happening by very wealthy people. But it was happening at a smaller scale, where you had a person who might be wealthy in that particular community, but who was actually based in that community and had some basic concern for the well-being of that community. It was not a panacea. They had interests that in all sorts of ways diverged from those of everyday people and their readerships. But it was somewhat better than we have now. And so I think we need to look at consolidation in the online media space, the offline media space, and try to create a more democratic media ecosystem.
So we have about a minute left. I want to be able to give you an opportunity to let people know where they can reach out to you if they want to either volunteer or to donate to your campaign or to learn more about some of the issues that you are running on in the 2nd Congressional District. So how do people find you?
Sure thing. Thank you for asking. My website is David Segal. It's SEGALRI.com. And my Twitter handle, I think, is also @DavidSegalRI. And folks should feel free to connect there. We have a pretty robust platform that talks about what I want to do. And also, I think in each case, discusses my background of work on those same issues. Because as I was saying earlier, I'm fortunate to have been able now to have worked on most of the issues of the day at some point over the course of my 20 years of public service and advocacy around public policy. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Fantastic. So yes, I was studying your website in preparation for this interview, and I can vouch for the fact that there's a lot of good information up there, particularly some very interesting information about your family and your upbringing and your childhood and the like. So I thank you for taking the time, David, to chat with us about some of the big issues that are facing corporate America, that are facing our communities, facing the planet, and invite you to come back at any time to chat more with us as the campaign continues. So thanks again.
Thanks so much.